The morning light at Caldmere Hall was the color of cold marble, which suited the room exactly. Susannah Wycliffe, née Hale, married fewer than 18 hours, sat at a breakfast table long enough to seat 14 and watched her husband lift his coffee cup with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once been surprised by his own life. She had known, when she agreed to this marriage, that it would not be warm. She had known it would be a transaction. Her father's security purchased at the price of her hand, and she had told herself she could bear a cold arrangement, that she was practical enough, that she had buried worse disappointments than an indifferent husband. She had not known, until this particular morning, sitting across from Marcus Wycliffe in the gray light with her own cup still steaming in her hands, that a man could speak to his wife in the same tone he used to brief his estate steward, and that hearing it, the words arranged so neatly, so bloodlessly, would produce in her not tears, but something closer to astonished, helpless laughter. He had set down his cup. He had looked at her, not unkindly, which was almost the worst of it, and he had said in a voice as even as a ruled line that he wished to be clear about the arrangement. "I require an heir," Marcus said, the words as considered as a legal instrument. "Once that obligation is fulfilled, and I expect it will be fulfilled within the first year or two, you will retire to Ashmore. It is a pleasant enough property. You will have an income and a household. You will be comfortable." He picked up his cup again. "I thought it best to state this plainly, rather than allow any misunderstanding to develop." Susannah looked at him across the length of white tablecloth. She looked at the precise part of his dark hair, the immaculate fall of his coat, the way his hand rested on the cup handle with the same proprietorial ease with which it rested on everything in this house. She thought of her father's apothecary and Ray, the smell of dried valerian and beeswax and wood smoke, the queue of people at the door before 8 in the morning. She thought of the settlement, her father's care secured, the price she had agreed to pay. Then she set down her own cup, and she laughed. It was a real laugh, not a performance, not a social weapon, but a genuine, startled burst of amusement at the sheer, breathtaking audacity of what she had just been handed. A delivery schedule? She had been given a delivery schedule over coffee the morning after her wedding by a man who had not once in the preceding 6 months asked her name before the solicitors had. Marcus blinked. It was, she suspected, the first time in recent memory that a response of his had produced laughter rather than compliance. "I am glad," he said after a moment, "that you take it in good spirits." "I take it in the only spirit it deserves," Susannah said, and picked up her fork and finished her breakfast. She ate methodically, eggs, toast, a portion of cold ham, and she did not speak again, and neither did Marcus, who returned to his correspondence with the faint air of a man who has handled a minor administrative matter satisfactorily. The footmen stood at their posts. The fire crackled in the grate. Outside, the formal gardens lay in precise, frost-edged rows, and the whole of Caldmere Hall hummed with the quiet industry of a house that knew its own importance. By noon, Susannah had sent for her maid. By 3 in the afternoon, her trunks were being carried down the east staircase. By 5, she was in the carriage, and by dusk, the last light going out of the sky over the road south toward Ray, Caldmere Hall was behind her, and her husband's delivery schedule with it. The household had watched from the upper windows. Grayson, the butler, had stood at the foot of the stairs with an expression of controlled distress. 2 of the younger maids had pressed close to the glass in the servants' corridor, watching the carriage roll through the gatehouse arch. Mrs. Pell, the housekeeper, had gone to find the dowager. Augusta Wycliffe, Dowager Duchess of Caldmere, received the news in her sitting room with a stillness that was more alarming than any outburst. She sat for a long moment with her hands folded over her embroidery frame. And then she called for her writing desk and composed a note to her son in the time it took a lesser woman to decide on an opening line. The note was brief. It said, in effect, that the wife had gone, that this was intolerable, and that Marcus would ride to Ray before the week was out and then bring her back before the whole county decided she had been right to leave. Marcus read the note at his desk. He set it aside. He poured himself a second glass of port, and he sat for a time in the firelight of his study, and he thought, with the untroubled certainty of a man who has never yet been wrong about what people will do, that she would be back within the week. The apothecary's daughter, faced with the reality of her father's situation and the distance from comfort, would come to her senses. They always did, when the alternatives were weighed clearly. He was not alarmed. He did not send a reply to his mother. He did nothing at all. 3 weeks passed. Susannah did not come back. She had arrived in Ray on a Tuesday evening, let herself into the apothecary on the market square with her own key, and by Wednesday morning her sleeves were rolled to the elbow and she was seeing patients. She did not remove the title from her name. There was no legal instrument by which she could, and in any case, it was not the title she objected to. But she did not use it either. And when the carter's wife, who came for a chest complaint, addressed her as Mrs. Hale out of long habit, Susannah did not correct her. Word moved through 3 counties the way word always moves through small counties, faster than a horse, slower than the truth, and with considerably more embellishment. But the essential facts were accurate, and they were remarkable. The Duchess of Caldmere, the new one, the apothecary's girl Marcus Wycliffe had chosen for reasons no one in the county quite understood, had walked out of Caldmere Hall the morning after her wedding and returned to her father's practice. And she was now seeing a queue of patients every morning that stretched past the door and halfway around the market square. And the gentry were sending their children to her. And the vicar had brought her a case of persistent rash on his youngest that 3 physicians in the county had failed to resolve, and she had resolved it in a fortnight. The queue grew longer each morning. A magistrate's wife sent a note asking whether her own complaint might be considered. A baronet's daughter came in person. Susannah received them all in the same order, whoever arrived first. She did not make exceptions for rank. At Caldmere Hall, a letter arrived from the estate solicitor. It was careful in its language. Solicitors' letters always are. But its meaning was plain. The succession stood unresolved. The marriage had produced no issue. And the legal situation with respect to the heir presumptive, young Oliver Wycliffe, remained what it had been before the wedding. The letter noted, with the practiced delicacy of a man paid to be delicate, that the longer the current arrangement persisted, the more complicated the eventual settlement of the matter would become. Marcus read this letter also. He set it beside his mother's note on the desk. Augusta arrived at Caldmere 2 days later without announcement, which was her customary approach to everything she considered urgent. She came directly to Marcus's study, sat without invitation, and looked at her son across the width of his desk with the expression she had worn throughout his childhood when he had failed to meet a standard she considered elementary. 3 weeks, she said. I am aware of how many weeks it has been, Mother. The whole district is aware of how many weeks it has been, Augusta said. The whole district is also aware that your wife is running a medical practice from the market square at Ray, that she is treating persons of every class without distinction, and that she has apparently refused payment from Lord Harwick's household because she considered the complaint minor. She is becoming, Marcus? She is becoming admired. The word carried a weight of displeasure that suggested admiration was a form of scandal. You will ride to Ray. You will bring her home. You will do this before the entire district concludes that she was right to leave. And before that conclusion becomes a fact that neither of us can argue against. Marcus looked at his mother. Then he looked out the window at the formal gardens, gray under a November sky. She will come back, he said. She has not come back, Augusta said. And every morning she does not. The story changes. You chose her for her practicality. Use yours. Marcus said nothing more. But the following morning, he called for his horse. He arrived in Ray at 10:30 in the morning, which was, he would discover, the worst possible time to arrive at the apothecary on the market square. The queue at Susannah's door extended from the step, past the window, around the corner of the building, and some distance along the lane. A carter's wife with a shawl pulled tight against the November air. A small boy of perhaps 7, coughing into his mother's shoulder. An elderly man with a wrapped foot. A young woman holding a sleeping infant. Marcus dismounted, handed his reins to a boy who materialized from somewhere, and walked to the door of the apothecary. The young woman who answered his knock looked at him with the pleasant, unhurried competence of someone who had answered this door 100 times that month. "The Duchess is with a patient," she said. "If you'll join the queue, she'll be with you as soon as she's able." Marcus looked at the queue. The queue looked back at him with varying degrees of interest and no particular deference. "I am the Duke of Caldmere," he said. "Yes," said the young woman, without any evident alteration of her position on the matter. "She's with a patient. The queue is there." He waited 40 minutes. He stood in the November air behind the carter's wife and the coughing child, his rank acknowledged by no one, his horse tied at the post, his breath making small clouds in the cold. The carter's wife offered him a nod of companionable fellow-feeling. He did not know what to do with this, and so he nodded back. The child coughed. The queue moved, incrementally, toward the door. When he was finally shown into the back consultation room, Susannah was washing her hands at a basin. She dried them on a cloth, turned, and looked at him with the same steady, unimpressed attention she had turned on him at the breakfast table 3 weeks before. She did not look surprised to see him. She did not look pleased. "You have a remedy for something," she said, "or you've come to tell me to come home." "You will return to Caldmere," Marcus said. "The situation cannot continue." "You waited 40 minutes in the cold to say that," Susannah said. She moved to her work table and straightened a row of small bottles with the focused tidiness of a person who keeps order in her working space as a matter of discipline, not decoration. "I have 6 more patients this afternoon. Say what you came to say." "I have stated it," Marcus said. "Your obligations as my wife require your presence at Caldmere. The succession, Susannah said. And she turned to face him fully, and her voice was not raised, not even slightly, which was somehow more final than shouting would have been. "You sat across from me at your breakfast table the morning after our wedding and told me I was to produce an heir and then remove myself to a distant property and leave you to your life. You said it the way you'd tell a steward to repair a fence. You did not ask me my name before the solicitors arranged this marriage. You took my wrist at our first meeting to count my pulse, the way a man checks a horse's soundness, and you did not once look at my face while you did it." She set down the bottle she was holding. "I know exactly what I was brought to Caldmere to do. You may keep the house and the title and the bloodless arrangement you have built there. I am staying in Ray." Marcus stood in the small, herb-scented room and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. perhaps ever. The specific, unaccustomed sensation of having been seen clearly and found wanting by someone who was not afraid of him. He left the consultation room. He left the apothecary. He walked out into the lane, and he stood there for a long moment in the November air, his horse waiting at the post, the market square going about its ordinary business around him. He stood there long enough that the carter's wife, leaving by the front door with her remedy wrapped in paper, glanced at him with mild curiosity before moving on. Then he mounted his horse and rode back to Caldmere, and the feeling stayed with him the whole way. A sting he had no name for, and below it, something stranger, a thread of curiosity he could not quite dismiss. He came back 4 days later, in driving rain. He had no stated purpose. He had told himself, on the road, that he was coming to press the matter further, to apply different reasoning, more practical arguments. He arrived at the apothecary door in a coat that had been soaked through for the better part of an hour. And when Susannah opened the door herself, the young assistant had gone for the day. She looked at him standing in the rain, with the expression of someone observing a particularly stubborn form of foolishness. "Come in," she said, not warmly, but with the brisk practicality of a woman who does not leave people standing in the wet, regardless of their personal failings. She stepped back from the door. He came in, dripping on the flagstone floor of the dispensary. The room smelled of camphor and dried herbs and something faintly sweet he could not name. A fire burned in the small grate. Bunches of dried plants hung from the low ceiling beams. The disorder of the place was not chaos. It was the organized complexity of a working space. Everything where it needed to be for a person who knew where everything was. Susannah disappeared into the still room and returned a few minutes later with a small cup of something steaming. She pressed it into his hands without ceremony. "Drink it," she said. "Ginger root and willow bark. You'll have a chill by morning if you ride home in that state, and you'll be useless to everyone, which will be your own fault entirely." He looked at the cup. He looked at her. He drank it. It was bitter and hot, and it warmed him from the sternum outward in a way that the Caldmere fireplaces, for all their size, never quite managed. He stood in the dispensary with the empty cup in his hands and found, for once, that he had nothing to say. He came back a third time, 5 days after that, and this time he did not pretend to have a purpose. He came to the apothecary at midday, when the morning queue had cleared, and he asked Susannah, haltingly, in the voice of a man unaccustomed to asking rather than directing, whether she would show him how a remedy was made. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Come through," and led him into the still room. The still room was warm and close, the fire kept low and steady under a small copper vessel, the shelves lined with labeled jars and bundles of dried material, and the careful tools of her trade. She set a mortar on the work table and explained, as she worked, what she was compounding and why. The properties of each ingredient, the quantities, the order of addition, the reason a remedy made carelessly would fail or harm. She spoke with the plain authority of someone who had learned this knowledge through years of practice, not through books alone, and she did not simplify it for him, which he found, unexpectedly, that he respected. At some point she said, "Put your hand here," and guided his hand to the pestle, and he ground the dried material as she directed, and their hands were side by side on the handle. And then they were not quite side by side, but overlapping, and neither of them drew back. The still room fire crackled. Outside, the market square went about its business. Susannah looked at the mortar, not at him, and continued her explanation of the remedy's purpose in the same even voice. But she did not move her hand. He came back twice more in the following 10 days. Each time he stayed longer, each time he arrived with a question. A real question, not a pretext, about her work, her patients, the compounds she used, the cases she found most difficult. Susannah answered him honestly, watching the change in him with the careful, guarded attention of a woman who has been deceived before by what seemed like change. She did not encourage what was happening between them, but she did not end it either. He arrived on a Thursday morning, the sky clear and cold, and he came without his usual careful arrangement of purpose. He sat in the chair across from her work table. She had, at some point, stopped making him stand, and he set down a folded paper and looked at her directly. "I owe you an apology," Marcus said. "What I said at the breakfast table was indefensible. I treated you as a function to be managed, and I had no right to do so. I am telling you plainly that I was wrong." Susannah looked at the paper. She did not touch it. "I am also prepared," he continued, "to offer you full standing as my Duchess at Caldmere. Not the arrangement I described, but a real marriage, with the authority and position that belong to the role. Your father's settlement will be honored in full, as it should have been without condition from the beginning." He paused. "I am asking you to come back." The room was quiet. Outside, a cart moved across the cobbles of the market square. The horse's hooves unhurried on the stone. Susannah was still for a long moment. He watched her look at the folded paper and then look past it at something he could not see. And he thought, for one careful breath, that she might say yes. The settlement meant her father's care secured, the medicines he needed, the nurse who came 3 mornings a week. The cost of her refusal had been real, and she had been carrying it every day. Then she said, "What am I building in Ray?" Marcus said, "I beg your pardon?" "I am building something here," Susannah said. "A permanent dispensary, a place where anyone in this town, carter's wife, vicar's child, anyone, can come for treatment without wondering whether they can pay. I have been planning it for 2 years. I have spoken of it to everyone I know." She looked at him steadily. "You have come to this apothecary 6 times in the past 3 weeks. You have asked me about my compounds and my patients and how a pestle works. You have not once asked me what I am building or why or what it would serve." She folded her hands on the table. "Your apology covers your manners at the breakfast table. It does not cover the fact that you still have not asked me a single thing about who I am." The room held a silence of a different quality than the ones before. Not the silence of a man composing his next argument, but of one who has run out of prepared ground entirely. "I see," Marcus said at last. "I think you are beginning to," Susannah said. "But beginning is not the same as having arrived. And I am not going to leave what I am building here for a man who is still, at this moment, more interested in resolving his succession than in knowing his wife." She rose and showed him to the door, and this time the gesture was not unkind. It was precise, the way she was precise about everything, and it cost her something, which she did not allow him to see. That evening she sat at her father's bedside in the room above the apothecary, where Thomas Hale lay propped on pillows, with the careful stillness of a man who has learned to conserve what strength remains to him. She held his hand and told him what she had refused and why, and what it meant for the settlement. Thomas Hale listened with his eyes closed, and then he said, in the thin, quiet voice that was all he had left, "You were right, my girl." She pressed his hand and did not cry until after he was asleep. She did not reverse her decision. Augusta Wycliffe arrived in Ray on a Monday, without announcement, in a carriage bearing the Caldmere crest. She entered the apothecary without knocking, moved through the dispensary as though she owned it, which, in the way that mattered to Augusta, she considered she did, and found Susannah in the still room, grinding a preparation at the work table. Susannah did not look up immediately. She finished the grinding, set the pestle down, and turned. "Your Grace," she said, with the precise neutrality of a woman who will offer courtesy and nothing beyond it. Augusta did not sit, because Susannah had not offered her a chair, and Susannah did not offer her a chair. "I will be brief," Augusta said. "I have come to clarify your situation, since it appears my son has been unable to do so." She drew a folded letter from her reticule. "The building in which you are currently conducting your practice is leased from a tenant of the Caldmere estate. The lease renewal is in 3 months, and I am in a position to direct that it not be renewed." She set the letter on the work table. "Additionally, I have drafted a communication to the parish describing your absence from Caldmere as a willful breach of your marital obligations. I have not yet sent it. Whether I do depends on whether you are prepared to behave sensibly." Susannah looked at the letter. She looked at Augusta. The dowager was a tall woman, beautifully dressed, with the composed, assessing expression of someone who has spent a lifetime managing difficult people and found the management largely satisfying. "You arranged this marriage," Susannah said. "You selected me, the apothecary's girl, no powerful family, no one to make demands. Because you wanted a vessel for the line and no complications attached to it. You treated me as a livestock before your son ever had the opportunity to do the same." She moved the letter to one side of the work table, not touching it, simply clearing the space between them. "I want to say something to you clearly, and I would like you to hear it." Augusta's expression did not change, but she waited. "You raised a man who does not know how to see another person," Susannah said. "I have seen his schooling records. He mentioned them. The health reviews, the fitness assessments, all in the same hand, the same columns, the same accounting as the estate livestock. You kept those records, didn't you?" It was not a question. "You bred your son to be the heir and nothing else. And then you are surprised, genuinely surprised, I think, when he sits across from his wife and speaks to her like a steward briefing a tenant." She picked up her pestle again. A woman who raised her child as an instrument should not be astonished when the people around her decline to perform their assigned functions. Augusta stood very still. "The lease," Susannah continued, "and the letter to the parish. Do what you think you must. I have built this practice once. I can build it again elsewhere if I have to. But I will not be bought, and I will not be frightened. And I think you already knew that. Which is why you came yourself rather than sending a solicitor." Augusta left. She had delivered both threats. She had received no capitulation. She sat in the Caldmere carriage on the road home with her hands folded in her lap and her face arranged in its usual composed lines. And that evening she wrote to the family solicitor and instructed him to begin examining the grounds on which the marriage might be set aside. Marcus found the documents in the East Wing archive, in a cedar chest he had not opened in 30 years. He had gone looking for the family entail records in response to the solicitor's inquiry about setting the marriage aside. The legal technicalities required documentation, and Marcus had always handled his own legal affairs. He found the entail records. He also found, in the same chest, a series of ledgers bound in dark green cloth, and he opened the first one and stood in the cold archive room reading for a very long time. His schooling schedule in his mother's hand. The tutor's reports, cross-referenced against a standard of performance Augusta had established before he was 8 years old. His health reviews, quarterly, from the age of 4, each one noting his height, his weight, his physical condition, his assessed suitability for the demands of the succession. His childhood illnesses recorded not as a mother's concern, but as a manager's risk assessment. A letter from Augusta to his father, written when Marcus was 12, discussing the question of whether he ought to be sent to school or kept at home. Framed entirely as a question of what would best serve the heir's development, with no reference to what Marcus himself might want or feel or find. He closed the ledger. He stood in the archive for a while longer. Then he rode to Ray. He did not send a note ahead. He arrived at the apothecary in the early afternoon, and Susannah received him in the dispensary, the last of the day's patients having gone. She looked at him when he came through the door, and something in his face made her set down what she was holding. "Sit down," she said. He sat, and then he told her what he had found. Plainly, without softening it or framing it or asking for anything in return. He described the ledgers, the health reviews, the fitness assessments. He told her what it had been like to read his own childhood recorded in columns, the way the livestock were recorded in the estate books, in the same hand, with the same dispassion. He said, without drama, that he had begun to understand what he had been made into, and that the thing he had said at the breakfast table, the delivery schedule, the heir and vanish, was the only language he had ever been given for what a person was for. Susannah listened to all of it. She did not offer him absolution. She did not tell him that it explained everything, or that she understood now, or that the knowledge changed what had happened between them. Understanding where it came from, she said, is not the same as having undone it. You did what you did. Knowing why doesn't reach back and make it different. I know that, Marcus said. Good, she said. He rose. He did not press her further. He went to the door, and then he stopped with his hand on the frame, and said, without turning, "I am sorry about your father's settlement. That is the part of this I find I cannot." He stopped. "I am sorry for that," he said, and left. Susannah stood in the dispensary after he had gone and looked at the empty doorway for a long moment, and then she went back to work. The rider came at first light on a Thursday. Susannah heard the horse in the lane below and was at the window before the knock came at the door. Years of night calls had made her a light sleeper. The young man at the door was from Greenlaw, the Wycliffe property 4 miles east, and his face told her everything before he spoke. "It's the boy," he said. "Master Oliver. He's been burning 2 days, and the London physicians. There are 2 of them. They came up from town. They say they've done what they can, and he's worse, not better. And His Grace." He caught his breath. "His Grace sent me himself, ma'am. He said to ask, if you would come." Asked, she noted, not commanded. She had her bag in her hand before the rider had finished speaking. Greenlaw Cottage was not, despite its name, a cottage. It was a substantial property, warm and well-maintained, where Marcus's young cousin Oliver lived with his widowed mother. Susannah arrived to find the house in the particular hush of a place where something serious is happening, and everyone knows it. The London physicians, 2 distinguished men with a careful, slightly defensive manner of experts who have not succeeded, met her in the corridor outside Oliver's room. They described the case. Susannah listened, asked 4 questions, and went in. Marcus was in the room, standing by the window. He had been there, she judged, for most of the 2 days. His coat was off, his shirt was without its usual precision, and he had the specific, hollow-eyed look of a man running on fear and refusal to leave. He turned when she entered. She did not speak to him. She went directly to the child. Oliver Wycliffe was 6 years old, small for his age, with dark hair damp against his forehead and cheeks the color of a coal fire. Susannah set her bag on the chair, took the boy's pulse, looked at his throat and his skin and his breathing, and asked the nurse who had been sitting with him a series of questions the London physicians had not thought to ask. Then she opened her bag. "I need water," she said to the room. "Clean, cold, and more lamps, all of them. And something to boil water in, here in the room, not downstairs." People moved. Marcus moved with them, and when he returned with a lamp, she directed him to hold it where she needed light. And he held it without comment, without question, exactly where she said. The hours that followed were not dramatic in any visible way. They were long and careful and very quiet. Susannah worked with the methodical focus of a woman who has sat with fever cases through the night before, who knows what to watch for and what it means, who does not panic at the peak because she has been to the peak before, and knows there is a way through. She administered the remedy she had compounded. She bathed the child's face and neck. She monitored his breathing and his pulse and made small adjustments with the calm of someone reading a map in familiar territory. Marcus did whatever she told him. He held lamps. He fetched water. He turned the child when she said turn. He sat when she said sit, and stood when she needed the chair. The London physicians hovered in the doorway for a time, and then, by some unspoken consensus, withdrew to wait in the corridor. Oliver's mother sat in the corner, silent, watching Susannah with the absolute focused attention of a woman who has placed all her faith in one pair of hands. Somewhere past 2 in the morning, the boy's fever climbed to its highest point. Susannah had been expecting it. She worked quietly through it, making no change to her pace, her hand steady, her voice level when she spoke to the child. Murmuring to him, telling him about the market square in Ray, the smell of dried lavender, the horse that stood outside the apothecary every Wednesday and tried to eat the hanging herb bundles. She spoke as though he could hear her, because she believed he could. Marcus, who had been crouching beside the bed holding a lamp at the angle she required, felt the strength go out of his legs then. The accumulated weight of 2 days of fear and the long night and the sight of this small, burning boy. And he sat down heavily on the floor beside the bed. Susannah, without looking up from the child, put her hand flat against his chest and held him steady for a moment, the way she might steady any person in danger of falling, purely practical, purely present. Later, she could not have said how much later, she was kneeling at the bedside and her hand was resting over Oliver's, monitoring his pulse, and she became aware that Marcus's hand had found hers in the dark and was holding it, and she did not remove it. The house was very quiet. The lamps burned low. Oliver's mother had fallen asleep in her chair. At some point, the quality of the boy's breathing changed, a settling, a deepening, and Susannah knew it before the color in his cheeks confirmed it. She checked his pulse. She checked it again. Then she sat back on her heels and let out a slow breath. "The fever is breaking," she said. Oliver slept on, peaceful and ordinary, a small boy in a warm room, his chest rising and falling with the easy rhythm of the simply tired. Marcus did not speak. He sat on the floor beside the bed with his head bowed, and Susannah could see, in the low lamplight, that his hands were trembling slightly, not from cold. By the time the first gray light came in at the window, the household had gathered in the corridor. The nurse, the London physicians, the housekeeper, 2 footmen, Oliver's mother, who had woken at dawn and come to stand in the doorway, with her hand pressed to her mouth. They had watched the whole night. They had seen the Duchess of Caldmere work through the longest hours with her sleeves rolled and her bag open on the chair, directing their Duke like an assistant, and their Duke following her direction without a word of protest. At the door, in the early light, Susannah pulled on her coat and picked up her bag, and Marcus stood beside her, and neither of them had slept, and both of them were worn to the bone, and the world outside the door was quiet and pale and new-washed. He looked at her. He said, not in the imperative, not in the measured tone of a man issuing instructions, but in the plain voice of someone who has had everything stripped away and is left with only what is true. You are the most remarkable person I have ever known, and I wasted the only chance I was given by being exactly what I was made to be, before I understood what else I might have been. Susannah looked at him in the early light. She looked at the man who had handed her a delivery schedule over coffee, and then stood in her queue in the cold, and come to her door in the rain, and asked her real questions for the first time in his life, and spent a night on the floor of a sick room following her instructions, because the child's life was more important than his rank. She looked at all of it, and at him. Then she stepped forward and kissed him. Once, slowly, with the full, deliberate intention of a woman who does not do things by accident. Not granted. Decided. When she drew back, he was very still, looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Go home, she said quietly. Sleep, and then we will see. He went to Caldmere. He called the household together in the entrance hall. Grayson, Mrs. Pell, the footman, the senior staff. And he stood at the foot of the great staircase where the Wycliffe portraits looked down in their ordered rows. And he spoke clearly enough that every person in the hall could hear him without straining. My wife will not be returning to Caldmere under the terms I described on the morning after our wedding, he said. Those terms were wrong, and I stated them, and I will not pretend otherwise. I am not setting my marriage aside. Anyone who has been given to understand otherwise has been given incorrect information. He paused. The Dowager Duchess's authority over the domestic arrangements of this estate is withdrawn, effective today. The solicitor from London may go home. Augusta, who had positioned herself at the top of the staircase, she had heard him calling the household together and had come to observe, looked down at her son with an expression that moved through several distinct phases before settling into something that was not quite acceptance, but was, perhaps, the beginning of understanding that she had lost. Marcus looked up at her for a moment. Then he turned and walked out the front door. He rode to Ray. He did not go to the apothecary door. He went to the market square, tied his horse at the post, and stood in the queue. The queue was shorter than usual, a midweek afternoon, the morning rush long past. But there were 3 people ahead of him. An elderly woman with a wrapped wrist, a young man with a cough, a girl of perhaps 12 holding a jar, and a list in her mother's handwriting. Marcus stood behind them in the November air, and waited, and no one paid him particular attention, because a man waiting in the queue at the apothecary was a man waiting in the queue at the apothecary, and the market square of Ray had more interesting things to look at. When he was shown through, Susannah was in the dispensary, writing in her case record. She looked up when he came in. She waited. He did not speak first. He sat in the chair across from her work table, and he said, "Tell me about the dispensary." She looked at him. "You said you've been planning it for 2 years," he said. "I want to know what it is, what you need, what you intend it to serve. I want to hear all of it." He settled back in the chair, and his posture was not the careful, controlled arrangement of the Duke of Caldmere. It was simply a man sitting down, prepared to listen. I will not speak until you've finished." Susannah set down her pen. She told him. She told him about the building she had identified on the east side of the market square. Larger than the apothecary, with a room that could serve as a proper examination space, and another that could store supplies in sufficient quantity. She told him about the women in the outlying villages who could not reach Ray on a bad day, and the plan for a monthly circuit. She told him about the training she wanted to offer. Young women, primarily, who had the aptitude for the work and nowhere to learn it formally. She told him about the costs and the obstacles and the people in the town who had already pledged support and the people who had not, and why, and what she intended to do about each of them. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer solutions or redirect the conversation or indicate by any movement or expression that he had somewhere else to be. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Marcus reached into his coat pocket and set his ducal signet ring on her work table, beside the small dish of dried lavender that had sat there as long as he had been visiting. The ring was gold and heavy and bore the Caldmere arms, and it looked, on the plain wooden table beside the lavender, slightly absurd and entirely sincere. "The building on the east side of the square," he said, "is held by a Caldmere tenant. I will arrange the transfer of the lease to you directly, with no conditions attached." He looked at her. "I would also like to ask, in plain terms, whether I may stay and learn. Not as your patron, not as your husband managing an arrangement. As a person who has a great deal to learn and believes you are the only one who can teach him." Susannah looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought of the breakfast table at Caldmere, the marble and the coffee and the delivery schedule, and she thought of the still room and the pestle and the long night at Greenlaw, and she thought of her father asleep in the room above, and the dispensary she was going to build, and the man sitting across from her who had stood in her queue and listened to every word she said, and put his rank on her work table like something he was willing to set down. She picked up the ring and turned it in her fingers, and then she set it back in the dish of lavender, and she said, "Yes, you may stay." Some weeks later, on a morning when the light came in sideways across the market square and the stalls below were just beginning to set up, Susannah's rooms above the apothecary held the particular warmth of a space that has been properly lived in. The fire was low in the grate. The work table was spread with the materials of a simple remedy: dried chamomile, a small jar of honey, the mortar and pestle that had sat on that table for years. Oliver Wycliffe, recovered and rosy and possessed of the boundless, cheerful energy of a 6-year-old who has been ill and is now emphatically not ill, was asleep on the settle by the window, wrapped in a blanket, his dark hair against the cushion. He had arrived the previous afternoon with his mother, and he had stayed because he liked it here. Because of the smell of the still room and the interesting jars, and because Susannah let him hold things carefully and explained what they were for. Marcus sat at the work table. He was following Susannah's instruction on grinding the chamomile, not quickly, not carelessly, but with the focused, slightly awkward attention of a man learning a physical skill for the first time late in life, his large hands working the pestle with more force than was strictly necessary. "Slower," Susannah said, without looking up from what she was measuring. "You're not subduing it. You're releasing it." "There is a difference," Marcus said. "There is always a difference," she said, and glanced at him sideways, and the corner of her mouth moved. He slowed the pestle. He watched his own hands, and then he watched her hands, and he tried to understand what she was doing and why. And he asked her, and she told him, and he asked again, and she told him again, and the market square came alive outside the window. Voices, a cart, the sound of the horse that always tried to eat the herb bundles. and Oliver slept on in the warm, and the chamomile gave up its scent into the morning air. And Marcus Wycliffe, 6th Duke of Caldmere, sat at a woman's table in a room above a market square apothecary and asked and listened and stayed. The marble breakfast room at Caldmere was 40 miles away. It did not seem to matter.